Hi guys, Brooke and Laura here for Lawyering Outside the Lines. We're a couple minutes late. Laura was having some modem issues, and then earlier, if you're seeing us for the second time on this page today, our software that we use to broadcast our lives, for whatever reason, decided it was only going to give us this page as an option. So here we are again. So happy Tuesday. All July, we are talking diversity and inclusion in the legal profession and how we can all be agents of change. And we focused on issues faced by women generally about 2 weeks ago. However, that discussion doesn't necessarily address the unique issues faced by minority women in the legal profession, specifically Black female lawyers who are often unfairly lumped in by either gender or race, but not necessarily both. And there's an added layer of complexity for women of color in the legal profession. So today we are going to address some of the prevalent issues for women of color that they face within our profession. And we fully recognize that we are coming to this discussion from a place of privilege, and but for us, it's so important as allies to use our platform to advocate for diverse spaces, to ensure that women of color are present, to bring their voice and perspective to the table.
Exactly. And if you remember from last week, we kind of talked about what the differences are and what being an ally means. And everyone needs that ally who comes from that place of privilege to acknowledge and voice concerns so that they might be heard a little bit easier. Just, a little FYI, a little throwback to last week with our LGBTQ discussion. So let's talk about women. Women, regardless of race, share similar instances of discrimination and bias. But what additional unique challenges do women of color face? Brooke mentioned it. Let's talk about what some of those unique challenges that women of color are, what they face. So when conversations are had or policies made to improve gender diversity, unique challenges that women of color face are not typically addressed. And it's assumed. Assume is one of the worst words, I think, in the human language. It's assumed that these efforts are going to be equally effective for all women, and that's not necessarily the case. This assumption and lumping all women together is often, results in policies that are detrimental to women of color in the profession. The nuances between all women and women of color, and we're going to talk specifically mostly about Black women today, they're important because when we as a profession fail to acknowledge the distinct experiences of different women, women of color are the ones who suffer the most. So traditional gender roles of women are already seen to be contrary to the attributes deemed necessary for a good leader in our society. And as many of us already know, women who exhibit classic leadership traits like assertiveness are often seen as less likable, difficult, possibly it's their time of the month, whatever it might be. And to add another layer to that, Black women specifically are often seen as angry when they become expressive or stern about things. I can't tell you how many of my friends have been called a Black angry woman in a professional environment because they've just expressed concern or been, tell people what they have to do when they're in that leadership role. So women of color, these are experiences that they have unfortunately on a frequent basis. So some things that you might think about if you haven't already heard them, these following experiences really do happen, and they happen too often. They're constantly mistaken for clerical staff by partners in larger firms. So you've got 600 attorneys at your firm, might not know everybody, and you're going to be mistaken for staff as opposed to an attorney in the firm. They have heightened pressure to physically present themselves a certain way. It's really kind of disturbing, all the legislation that we've seen in schools and things like that, where hair is, has to be a certain way, and it really does discriminate mostly against Black women and Black men when it comes to those situations, so that, they have to be hyper aware that their self-presentation is, the way that it needs to be to avoid stereotypes and prejudices. They're tasked with recruiting other attorneys of color to the firm for diversity's sake. That's a lot of pressure, a lot of extra responsibility that they're often not compensated for as well. They have difficulty building authentic relationships with white male partners or white male colleagues, or to find advocates to help them advance in the workplace. They're often excluded from cases and networking events that could help them to advance in their work environment. And lastly, partners seek relationships with people that tend to look like them, which often excludes women of color, since the majority of partners are white men. They might be more comfortable approaching diversity by, mentoring a white woman as opposed to a Black woman. So these are things that you really need to keep in mind if you haven't heard your friends complain about this or talk about this in the past. Be aware that this is happening very frequently in professional environments.
Right. And these are not just cautionary tales. These experiences are actually reflected in some of the statistics. So there was a study in 2017 that in terms of partnership and leadership opportunities in law firms, a mere 2.8% of the equity partners in big law, which are these bigger law firms like Laura talked about, were women of color, compared to 20.6% of all women. Again, it's that nuance. And that's a 4.6 increase since 2007. There's also another study done in 2018. It was a report on diversity in U.S. law firms, and they found that that minority women continued to be the most dramatically underrepresented group at the partnership level, despite the increase in representation of all women lawyers just generally in recent years. And so minority women make up only 8.08% of U.S. firm lawyers, compared to 35.7% of all women and 16% of all minorities. And only 20% of minority women comprised summer associate classes of firms nationwide in 2018. And that's compared to 51% of all women and 35% of all minorities that year. So these trends are also evident when we're talking about the gender wage gap issues. So women of color are paid between 53 cents and 61 cents for every dollar paid to white men. And that's between 16 cents and 24 cents less even than white women compared to men, who are typically paid 77 cents for every dollar paid to white men. So the statistics are, evident enough. It's not just us saying that here are cautionary tales, here are stories, here are personal experiences. These experiences are actually backed by statistics, backed by this data.
Yes, and I know a lot of organizations and even, retail companies that do equal pay day, and offers them to look at the different kinds of equal pay and the differences when you're talking about minorities, as opposed to just the fact that it's, white women are paid 77 cents on the dollar. You can, help a cause, and also people can shop for 16 cents less on the dollar. So how can we as allies, because Brooke and I do consider ourselves allies in a lot of different situations, and especially when you're talking about marginalized groups and groups that have long-term systemically been held down. So how can we as allies and supporters help change the culture within our profession and help women of color to succeed? So number one, an option is, implicit bias training in your legal environment, whether that's your law firm or a bar association, that specifically speaks to the challenges that minority women lawyers face. Also, you can address the needs and concerns of women lawyers of color individually and separately from all women or all minorities categories, because it's its own unique category, and it really shouldn't be lumped in with all Black people, all women. It's also important for allies, sponsors, and those in positions of power to recognize the distinct obstacles women attorneys of color face and proactively enact plans to help eliminate those barriers. The legal profession must be more intentional about acknowledging women of color, whether through training or policy changes, because only then, once we acknowledge it and make steps towards that change, do we see gains at all levels, not just for women, because we know that that's a problem as well, but specifically for women of color. Another one is, have uncomfortable conversations. I love uncomfortable conversations. Most people, a lot of people don't like me because of that, but I love pushing people and making them think. And, having those uncomfortable conversations about the status quo and maintaining your privilege, oftentimes, that's very important. And oftentimes that privilege and the status quo is benefiting white people, all white people, and specifically white males in our legal profession. So it's difficult conversations, but it's really good to push people and make them think about things. Another really important thing is mentoring women of color. That's of great importance. We need to make sure that their talents are cultivated and that they're given the opportunities to grow just like any other person in that particular situation. It's just vital in our world.
Absolutely. And sometimes law firms and other organizations even don't necessarily understand how some of their policies and procedures are actually perpetuating racism, sexism, et cetera, things like that. And we specifically kind of today want to give a shout out to our friends over at Atlanta Legal Tech, who are so intentional in everything they do, not just in their organization and being inclusive of and promoting women of color. Back at the end of January, beginning of February, I had the honor of actually participating in their conference on a panel and leading a roundtable discussion. And it was just all around impressive. It was an amazing conference, but what really stood out to me most was that it was the only legal conference, and we go to a lot of legal conferences, that I had ever attended that was majority women, and at least half of those women were women of color. So we need more of that. We need to be more intentional. And also I mentioned Atlanta Legal Tech because if you're not part of their network or you don't subscribe to their newsletter, jump in and do that. But they recently sent out an email. They send out a lot of really amazing content. But they sent out an email this week about hiring with inclusivity in mind. And they actually shared some tips from lawyerist.com, which is another great organization if you don't follow them. But one tip that stood out to me specifically was beware, for our topic this week, was beware of your own unconscious bias. So try reading resumes without names to avoid gender or ethnic assumptions. So I actually have a friend from law school, and she is a white female, and she graduated at the top of our class and had a lot of trouble. She'd be sending her resume out and she wasn't getting calls. And then she was asking people just to find out what was happening. And her name actually sounds like a Black woman's name. And so she was actually not getting called. She was not even getting in the door. And so, those biases are real, even with all of her credentials. So she actually presents herself with initials now to overcome that, so she can at least get in the door and have a conversation. So all of that to say, and to give that example as an illustration, is that we as a profession can do better, and we hope that we can use our platform, that you use your platform to make sure that all women are having a voice at the table. But thank you guys so much for joining us today. This month is really important to us personally, but it should be very important to you to think about and discuss diversity and inclusion. We're going to be back next week with some more diversity and inclusion discussion at 1 Eastern, 12 Central, 11 Mountain, and 10 Pacific. We hope you have a good week and hope you give some consideration to some things we've discussed today, and see you next week. Thanks.